fight between Ladoke Akintola and Obafemi Awolowo originated over this quest for a northern alliance. Once Akintola became the premier of the Western region, he said that instead of collaborating with the northern minority parties as was the strategy, the Action Group AG should partner with the Northern People's Congress (NPC) itself. Amongst other things, Akintola argued, the free education policy of the West had created numerous school leavers which the economy of the region would soon be unable to absorb fast. And since the North was spending so much in keeping Indian, Pakistani and British expatriates in their schools and higher institutions, the graduates and school leavers of the Western region could be offered at cheaper rates just like in the 1920s and 1930s. And in the next two election cycles, that is by 1969, the North and the West would be economically indistinguishable from each other and would become a powerful voting bloc politically. While Akintola was certain the new improved Northern Alliance would be a force, Awolowo reckoned it would be a fraud. From 1952 to 1953, Northern legislators voted invariably for every bill the colonial government introduced, but voted against every bill Western legislators presented. When in 1952 the North was having problems enrolling children in conventional schools, Awolowo offered them spaces in some Western schools. The NPC replied that the only help they wanted from the West was for Awolowo to pull out those numerous Western children in Northern schools to make way for Northern children. Awolowo warned Akintola that the North had never been a reliable partner and that there could never be any fruitful cohesion with them. Akintola went ahead. Barely a year into coalition with the National Council of Nigeria and the Cameroon's NCNC, the NPC too became convinced that they were in a state of sustained eclipse and had been waiting on the moon. Now, they wanted to focus on the sun. When Prime Minister Abubakar Tafawa Balewa paid an official visit to Akintola, part of the agreement then was to work Awolowo into the government as the Deputy Prime Minister, a post that Balewa adamantly refused to give the NCNC. This secret coalition agreement was to be finalized and announced on February 2, 1962, when the Sardauner Sir Ahmadu Bello, the Premier of the Northern region, would come down to the University of Ibadan to commission the Sultan Bello Hall, named after his grandfather Muhammad Bello, the Sultan of the Sokoto Caliphate. Awolowo refused and chose to out the dirty secret coalition talks during the National Convention of the AG in Jos. He condemned Akintola, condemned the NPC, condemned the coalition talks, and affirmed that the AG under him would never have anything to do with the NPC again. Immediately after Chief Samuel Ladoke Akintola became the premier of the Western region, the strong walls of the ruling party, the AG, began to crack. Akintola was sworn in by the governor of the region, Obatadeniawu Adesoji Aderemi, who was also the Oni of Ile-Ife. Following a series of political actions and decisions taken by the new premier, who was also the deputy leader of the party, it dawned on Awolowo, the leader of the party, that Akintola was determined to run the show alone regardless of accepted party conventions and procedure. These actions, according to Chief Awolowo, include the unilateral appointment of ministers into the cabinet of the Western region, reduction in the price of cocoa and flat rate tax, exemption of women from taxation, and increase in assumed local contributions in Western Nigeria secondary grammar schools, among others. More importantly, Akintola was of the view that the experiment of separating the leadership of the party from the leadership of the government in the Western region had failed. What was left unsaid was that the premier ought to be the leader of the party. By the time the party came back from its Jos convention, it was clear to all and sundry that the festering wound of the action group had become an open sore. On February 9, 1962, the Ooni of Ife Oba Adesoji Aderemi called a peace meeting of the party leaders to resolve the differences between the two prominent men. The Ooni was supported in this regard by some leading Obas and chiefs in the region. The meeting, however, failed to conclusively effect a settlement. It was becoming apparent that something must give. On May 19, 1962, at a meeting of the Executive Committee of the Action Group, Awolowo leveled 3 charges against Akintola. The leader accused the deputy leader of maladministration and indiscipline. In support of the charges, Awolowo spoke for 4 hours. In his defense, Akintola denied the charges and spoke for 3 hours. The jury of party executives listened to both the plaintiff and the defendant. A motion calling on Akintola to resign as the premier was moved. The defendants group moved a counter motion for the premier to only be reprimanded and not removed. The counter motion was defeated. The motion for the premier to resign was carried by 81 to 29. The meeting had lasted for 11 straight hours. However, the party leadership waited patiently for Akintola's letter of resignation, but none was forthcoming. Akintola called a press conference and announced that he was not going to resign from his post as the premier. Instead of a letter of resignation, the embattled premier wrote 2 letters. The first letter was to the Ooni, asking the governor to dissolve the House of Assembly. The second letter was to the Speaker, calling for an emergency meeting of the House for a vote of confidence or otherwise. The Ooni and the Speaker were perplexed. How could the House be dissolved and a meeting of the House still be called at the same time? It was either for the House to be dissolved or for a meeting of the House to be called. Awolowo and Akintola were both legal practitioners. They were both brilliant men trained in the finest tradition of the British bar. They were both familiar with the Constitution of the Federation of Nigeria and the Constitution of the Western Region. They were also familiar with the common law of England as well as parliamentary practices in the Commonwealth. The question before Awolowo and the party was, how could the premier be removed from office? The issue before Akintola and his group was whether a premier could be removed from office. Awolowo then did the most natural thing. He requested 2 of the most brilliant legal minds in the region to prepare a legal advisory for the party. Chief Rotimi Williams, the legal advisor of the Action Group, and Mr. Eso Ighodaro, the Attorney General of the Western Region, accepted the assignments. The 2 legal giants spent sleepless nights consulting books of laws from various jurisdictions. The contentious provision itself was simply worded. It was the proviso to Section 33, subsection 10 of the Constitution of Western Nigeria, which provides that, quote, "The governor shall not remove the premier from office unless it appears to him that the premier no longer commands the support of a majority of the members of the House of Assembly." End of quote. Simple? Not quite. The duo of Williams and Ighodaro were of the firm opinion that the operative words in the provision were "unless it appears to him." The legal experts concluded that as long as it appeared to the governor in any form or format, the premier could be removed. It did not even have to be on the floor of the House. Armed with this legal advice, a form was prepared and members of the House who wanted Akintola to be removed as the premier appended their signatures. They were 66 in number. The form was sent to the governor, His Royal Majesty the Ooni of Ife. Based on the signatures of 66 members out of 112 as contained in the form forwarded to the king, it then appeared to the governor that the premier no longer commanded the support of a majority of the members of the House of Assembly. The governor then exercised his constitutional power. Obasa Adesoji Aderemi removed Chief Samuel Akintola as the premier. Akintola was in the premier's office when he was served with a letter from the governor removing him from office. The ousted premier immediately did three things after reading the letter. He called for a press conference to inform the world that he was still the premier. He then called on the Prime Minister, Sir Abubakar Tafawa Balewa, to remove Sir Adesoji Aderemi as the governor. Finally, he filed an action in court to restrain the governor from removing him from office. The Awolowo group was also not idle. Immediately they were informed that the governor's letter had been delivered to the now removed premier. The party's parliamentary group elected Akintola's Minister of Local Government, Alhaji Dauda Shoroye Ishola Adegbenro, as the new premier of the Western region. The governor was informed of the new appointments. Oba Adesoji Aderemi accepted the recommendation, and His Royal Majesty promptly administered the oath of office to the new premier. Alhaji Dauda Adegbenro, the Ekerin of Egbaland and the Balogun of Owu, had become the premier. The Commissioner of Police soon arrived. He pledged his services to the new premier. However, the Commissioner of Police was just leaving the newly installed premier when a signal came from Lagos. He was directed to forthwith withdraw his services and should take no instructions whatsoever from Adegbenro. The people of the Western region woke up on that fateful day in May to find out that they had two premiers. On one hand was Chief Akintola, who was claiming that his removal as the premier was ineffectual. On the other hand was Alhaji Adegbenro, who had just been sworn in as the premier and had appointed his cabinet members. Akintola remains adamant, screamed the banner headline of the Daily Times. On May 23, 1962, the Western Region High Court in Ibadan was filled. It was the case of the decade. The governor had removed the premier. In turn, the premier had asked the Prime Minister to sack the governor. The new premier, Alhaji Adegbenro, was however not a party to the case at this stage. The Chief Justice of the Western Region then was Justice Samuel Kwashi Idun. His lordship was however not in Ibadan at the time the suit was filed. The Chief Justice was on a tour of the Midwest area of the Western Region. Justice Olujide Shomolu quickly sent a message to his lordship to return to Ibadan for the very important case. Chief Akintola's legal team was led by a Queen's Counsel, Chief Ladipo Moore, the brilliant son of the legendary lawyer Eric Moore, whose daughter Kofuorola Moore became the first black African female graduate from Oxford University. She would then marry Prince Adetokunbo Ademola, the son of the Alaki of Abeokuta, Oba Samuel Ladapo Ademola, who then became Nigeria's first indigenous Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. The Oni was also represented by a Queen's Counsel, the indomitable Rotimi Williams, whose brilliance was unparalleled. The proceedings had hardly begun when Chief Akintola's counsel fired the first salvo. Ladipo Moore objected to the competence of Rotimi Williams to appear for Sir Adesoji Aderemi. The court agreed with his submission. Chief Williams was refused permission to continue to act as counsel for the Oni. The governor promptly instructed another brilliant counsel, Barrister Akinyele, to lead his defense. It was at this stage that Chief Ladipo Moore advised his clients on the need for them to join Alhaji Adegbenro as a defendant. Immediately after he was joined, Alhaji Adegbenro filed a counterclaim against Chief Akintola. It was now a case of two premiers and the governor. Where would the pendulum swing? While the case was going on, Alhaji Adegbenro had moved into the Premier's office. He had started functioning as the Premier and was also using the Premier's official car. In fact, when he was later restricted under the emergency regulations, it was the official car of the Premier that took him to Osogbo, his place of restriction. On the adjourned day, Ladipo Omo argued his application for an injunction to restrain Sir Adesoji Aderemi from purporting to relieve Chief Ladoke Akintola of his office as Premier in the absence of a resolution of the House of Assembly. The motion was opposed by Barrister Akinyele, who argued that since Chief Akintola was no longer the Premier, there was nothing for the court to restrain. It was a classical advocacy at its best. His Lordship listened to the arguments of the two brilliant advocates. It was indeed a very difficult case. The court then made two rulings. His Lordship granted the injunction prayed for by the man who would later become the Ààrẹ Ọ̀nà Kakanfò of Yoruba land. Justice Kwashi Idun ordered Alhaji Adegbenro not to assume the office of Premier. In other words, Chief Akintola was to continue in office, at least pending the determination of the suit itself. With regard to the substantive suit, the Chief Justice referred the case to the Supreme Court because of its grave constitutional importance. At the Supreme Court, it became a battle royale. The Apex Court itself admitted that it was being called to perform a difficult duty. Something like that had never happened before. There was no precedent to be followed. The Supreme Court then did something. It invited all the attorneys general in the country to appear as amici curiae, that is, not a party to a particular litigation, but permitted by the court to advise it. It was, however, only the Eastern Nigeria Attorney General who was absent. He sent his Solicitor General to assist the courts. 4 Lord Justices sat to hear the case. Sir Adetokunbo Ademola presided as the Chief Justice of the Federation. Also on the panel was Honorable Mr. Justice Lionel Brett, a Second World War veteran, who was the last expatriate to serve as Nigeria's Solicitor General. Justice Idowu Taylor was also on the panel. The Magistrates Court Complex at Igboshere, Lagos is named after him. Another night, Sir Vae Beramian was the 4th Justice. The question before the court was whether the governor could remove the Premier based on a letter signed by a body of members of the House, and not as a result of a vote of no confidence on the floor of the House. In other words, how would it appear to the governor that the Premier no longer enjoyed the support of the majority of parliamentarians? After exhaustive deliberations, Justice Adetokunbo Ademola held that the governor exceeded his constitutional powers. Justices Taylor and Baramian agreed with his lordship. Justice Brett was, however, unable to agree with the reasoning of the majority. Chief Akintola's group erupted with happiness. Akintola, himself a master linguist, did not allow the moment to go without poking fun at his opponents. However, the Federal Supreme Court in Lagos was not the final court of appeal at the time. Alhaji Adegbenro appealed to the Privy Council in London. On May 27, 1963, the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council delivered its judgment. 5 Lord Justices had the appeal, which had come all the way from the Federal Supreme Court of Nigeria. The Privy Council held that the Federal Supreme Court misapplied the law. The council agreed that the governor could exercise his power to remove the Premier as long as he was convinced that the Premier no longer commanded majority support in the House. The council therefore allowed the appeal and reversed the majority decision of Ademola, Baramian and Taylor, but upheld the minority decision of Brett. In effect, the council held that Oba Adesoji Aderemi exercised his power to remove Akintola constitutionally. Adegbenro had won. The Privy Council did not stop there. It also directed Akintola to pay Adegbenro the sum of £1,140 and 8 shillings as the costs incurred in prosecuting his case from Nigeria to the United Kingdom. This time around, it was the turn of Adegbenro's group to erupt with joy, but it was a short-lived one. As the Privy Council Lord Justices were signing off on their judgments in London, something was happening back home in Nigeria, in Ibadan. On the same day, the Western House of Assembly in Ibadan amended its constitution. Recall that the decision of both the Supreme Court and the Privy Council was based on the proviso to Section 33, subsection 10, earlier quoted. Minutes after the Privy Council had announced its decision, the provision was amended by adding the following phrase: in consequence of the passing of a resolution in the House of Assembly by a majority of the members of that House. That was not all. The amendment was also backdated by 3 years. It was deemed to have taken effect from October 1960. In other words, the decision of the governor taken in 1962 was now null and void because it was not in consequence of the passing of a resolution in the House of Assembly by a majority of the members of that House. Also, the decision of the Privy Council delivered in 1963 was of no legal effect. The long and short of it is that Chief Akintola had never been removed as the Premier, legally speaking. Adegbenro had scored his goal in London. Unfortunately, the goalpost had been moved in Ibadan. That, however, was not the end of the story. Alhaji Adegbenro, the Ekerin Egba, had lost the premiership, but was not about to lose the cost awarded in his favour by the Privy Council. He filed an application at the Supreme Court of Nigeria for the court to direct the Premier to pay him his costs. He was represented this time by Akintola, while Chief Akintola was represented by Ladipo. Akintola argued that he would not pay any cost because his government had nullified the decision of the Privy Council. The court disagreed. The Apex Court found merit in the application of Alhaji Adegbenro. The court ordered Chief Akintola to pay Alhaji Adegbenro the costs incurred in the Supreme Court of Nigeria in Lagos and the Privy Council in London. Chief Akintola had no choice but to comply and pay the costs. So, why were appeals still being taken to the Privy Council notwithstanding Nigeria's status as an independent country? The reason is simple. It was because Nigeria remained a Commonwealth realm with Queen Elizabeth II as head of state. The country was not yet a republic. However, in October 1963, the Republican Constitution came into effect and the Queen ceased to be head of state and was replaced by Nnamdi Azikiwe as President of the Federal Republic of Nigeria. As a result, Nigeria became a republic and appeals to the Privy Council were abolished. The Supreme Court then became the final court of appeal for the Federal Republic of Nigeria. However, for Akintola, the story continues. Akintola secured as Premier of the Western Region and the head of the new government at Ibadan, he formed a new party, the United People's Party (UPP), which consisted of those former Action Group members he was able to win to his side on his expulsion from the party. It was a coalition government which was formed by the UPP and the NCNC, which had previously formed the opposition. The Action Group Party, which had previously formed the government of the Western Region, now moved into the opposition. In 1964, the UPP evolved to be the Nigerian National Democratic Party (NNDP), with Akintola as leader and as a friend of the ruling party, the NPC. Hence, the 1965 Western Regional elections gave the NPC another chance to maintain its political power in the country, a hegemony which other political powers found annoying. More importantly, the NNDP was determined to remain in power. In the face of all overwhelming odds against the NNDP, should the elections be free and fair, it was left with one alternative: to rig the elections. Whether or not the NNDP was following precedents established by previous political parties, the massive rigging of the Western Regional elections of October 11, 1965 was flabbergasting. The methods of electoral fraudulence employed were the familiar ones, but the scale to which they were used was much more severe. The Electoral Commission publicly admitted that the electoral officers were kidnapped and therefore could not carry out their duties, while some refused to accept nomination papers of certain candidates and others failed to report for duty. Many candidates who had obtained validity papers were elected unopposed. The inability of the candidates to register aside, there were questions about ballot papers floating around in the West, despite the precautionary measures of giving the ballot papers to the police. The use of party agents and thugs camouflaged as members of the local government police was common, and rigging was employed in every conceivable means. Counting was not completed in some stations before the results of these stations were broadcast over the radio. Some candidates were declared elected, although their opponents scored higher votes. As a result of these grave irregularities, the NNDP won the elections, 16 of its candidates having been returned unopposed at the close of nominations. It was publicly charged that the NNDP victory was due to fraud. The political atmosphere in the Western region looked bleak and dismal, and the after effects of the elections were even more severe and devastating. Defeated political candidates had, in the past, run to the courts to challenge irregularities at elections. This time, they did not go to the courts. Instead, the people took the law into their hands. Riots, looting, arson, and murder were the rule of the day. Party thugs poured gasoline on opponents and set them on fire, a situation then known as Operation Wet Tear. Properties, bags of cocoa, and other procedure of opponents awaiting shipments were also set on fire. Without a doubt, the destruction of property was not as horrifying as setting human beings on fire. By November 1, 1965, a riot at Ekiti resulted in the death of 15 people, while a fresh riot 4 days later caused the loss of 20 lives. 16 people were killed in Ijebu-Ode and Ondo areas on November 7, 1965. Houses and vehicles were set on fire, and to travel within the Western region and from other regions into the West was a menace because of thugs and gangsters who took law into their own hands, while the police failed to maintain law and order. There was tension and wanton destruction of human life and property. Nigerians looked to the federal government to step in to arrest the situation in the region, but all pleas were to no avail. Meanwhile, the riots and killings continued, and the unpopular NDP government of the Western region imposed curfews in Mushin, Ikeja, Agege, Ajeromi, and Awori districts. Yet, the disturbances continued, and each day brought a toll of rioting, arson, looting, and murder. So, why did Akintola stick to his position and refuse to resign even when his government was unpopular? Akintola stuck to his guns largely due to his strong political convictions and determination to maintain his authority and political control over the Western region, especially in the face of rising opposition. He was involved in a power struggle with Chief Obafemi Awolowo, the leader of the Action Group, the party that initially brought both men into prominence. Akintola, who served as deputy to Awolowo, later fell out with him over the direction of the party and the regional government. Akintola and Awolowo had different political ideologies and strategies for governing the Western region. While Awolowo advocated for a socialist welfare state with a focus on education and social services, Akintola favored a more conservative pro-business capitalist approach. He also believed in fostering closer ties with the federal government led by the MPC, which he thought would better serve the Western region's interests. Akintola's alignment with the MPC contrasted sharply with Awolowo's opposition to the ruling Federal Party, leading to deep political divisions. Ladoke Akintola was caught in the larger political dynamics of post-colonial Nigeria. His alliance with the MPC and the federal government under Sir Ahmadu Bello and Prime Minister Abubakar Tafawa Balewa led to accusations of betrayal by his party and supporters of Awolowo, who viewed the MPC as a rival for political dominance. However, Akintola believed that aligning with the MPC would ensure political stability and economic development for the Western region. His refusal to back down from this alliance caused further conflict within the Action Group and led to his eventual expulsion from the party. These disagreements between Akintola and Awolowo culminated in the Western region political crisis of 1962. Akintola's insistence on remaining in power, despite losing the support of key Action Group leaders, led to a breakdown in law and order. This crisis resulted in the federal government declaring a state of emergency in the Western region and suspending its government. Nevertheless, Akintola was eventually reinstalled as premier by the MPC-led federal government, further solidifying his position. Chief Samuel Ladoke Akintola had strong personal ambitions to remain a key player in Nigerian politics. He wanted to carve out his own political legacy, separate from that of Awolowo. By aligning himself with the MPC and creating a faction of the Action Group known as the Nigerian National Democratic Party (NNDP), Akintola sought to establish himself as a formidable political force in Nigeria. His refusal to compromise was also motivated by his belief that his approach to politics was in the best interests of the Western region. He believed that Awolowo's policies were potentially harmful to the region's economic growth and political stability, and that his own political strategy, which emphasized cooperation with the federal government, was crucial for maintaining peace and securing resources for the Western region. However, Ladoke Akintola's unyielding stance contributed to significant political unrest known as Operation Wetie and set the stage for deeper divisions that ultimately played a role in Nigeria's first military coup on the morning of January 15, 1966.